Dr. Joshua Blank at Texas Politics Project at UT Austin, thank you so much as always.
Thanks for having me.
The question is, can Ken Paxton survive in the Senate?
I think that's a really tough question to answer at this point, and there's a lot of moving parts here that are really difficult to disentangle. First and foremost, I think you start with what we saw in the Texas House of Representatives yesterday, where we saw really an overwhelming vote for conviction made up of a bipartisan group of Republicans and Democrats. There were very few defections among Republicans in defense of Ken Paxton, and even the defense that they mounted was really about procedure, more so than about the actual allegations. So on the record, it looks like the Senate has a lot to deal with. At the same time, there's the politics of this. Right before the House voted, the House became aware that Donald Trump had made a statement in support of Ken Paxton. So too did Senator Ted Cruz. And so the question then becomes, what kind of impact does the politics of this have on the Texas Senate? And the reality is in Texas that the Texas Senate is the more political body really than the Texas House.
So to your point, the fact that former President Donald Trump, Senator Ted Cruz came out in support of Ken Paxton, how big of a role is that going to play?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I mean, ultimately, the senators are going to have to deal with the evidence when placed before them, but they're also going to have to deal with the fact that the President of the United States and a very, very, very popular politician among Texas Republicans has come out in defense of Ken Paxton. The reality is this fits a fact pattern that should be very comfortable for a lot of Republican voters. One of their favorite elected officials being, potentially, or at least portrayed as being railroaded by some kind of a process. Does that weigh on senators, more so than the evidence put in front of them? That remains to be seen. A really big question that also gets, I think, relayed into this is what role does the lieutenant governor play in all this? The lieutenant governor is one of the former president's closest advisors here in Texas, and it's hard to imagine that the former president of the United States wouldn't have made a statement in support of Ken Paxton without the lieutenant governor being aware of it, if not endorsing it. So the question then becomes, what role does the lieutenant governor play in this whole process?
Well, he said the other day that he is not voting. He's just overseeing the process. So the question becomes, the Texas Constitution requires 2/3 of senators present to have to vote to support removal from office. And so that could be very tricky, right? Because the question is, what does Senator Angela Paxton do?
This is a big, big question mark here. Ultimately, ultimately, an impeachment process is not very common as the first and foremost thing. So anybody who says to you at the beginning, well, this is how it's done, is probably speaking with a little too much certainty than we can imagine. To your point, the Constitution requires 2/3 of senators present to convict for an impeachment. Now, this is the key. What does it mean to be present? Ultimately, it seems like statute and code require all of the senators to arrive at the Capitol for the impeachment proceedings, but then they have to adopt rules. All legislative bodies adopt rules for various proceedings, and the question then becomes, what do those rules look like? Does the Attorney General's wife and State Senator Angela Paxton have the ability to recuse herself, or does she have to make a vote? Additionally, State Senator Brian Hughes is named in one of the impeachment counts as providing essentially a phony request for an Attorney General's opinion. Does he recuse himself? Can either of them recuse themselves? And ultimately, we won't know the answer to that question until we know what kind of rules they adopt. And that's where the Lieutenant Governor comes in. Ultimately, the Lieutenant Governor has shown that he has a very tight grip on the Texas Senate. When you talk about Texas legislation, one of the things that people say colloquially is that in the Senate there's only one vote that counts, and that's that of the Lieutenant Governors. What kind of rules does he himself as the overseer want to see the Senate adopt? Now look, the Senate doesn't have to adopt the rules that the Lieutenant Governor prefers, but part of the reason the Senate is so closely controlled by the Lieutenant Governor is he has shown the ability to retaliate against those who don't go along with his preferred plan. But this is a big deal. This isn't legislation. This is an impeachment proceeding against a fellow Republican, a statewide elected official who seems to be in a lot of trouble. So the question then becomes, does the Senate cede this authority to the Lieutenant Governor, or do they take more control over it themselves? And these are all questions that I think are circulating around as we speak.
And so in other words, the rules in which Lieutenant Governor requests, depending on if senators go along with that, that could have a huge impact on the numbers needed to remove. Because if the senators recuse themselves and are not present, that lowers the threshold of how many senators are needed to remove him.
And that's why the rules are so important. If they decide that a senator can completely recuse themselves, then the denominator, the number that they have to achieve 2/3 of, goes down. If they say adopt a rule that allows someone to be present but not voting, then maybe the denominator stays the same and the threshold is higher. So even here in these sort of minor decisions actually are going to fundamentally impact the process.
You spoke before about former President Donald Trump's influence. He called out Governor Abbott on his social platform, saying, where is the governor? And the governor has been silent on this, and the governor has the authority to name an interim attorney general. What do you make of this situation? The fact that he's silent, and do you think that he will just let the process play out before naming an interim?
Well, I think it's interesting that the people who are making the most noise about this process are actually the people who are not involved in it. And what you find is that from the participants involved, members of the Texas House, members of the Texas Senate, the lieutenant governor, the governor, there's a lot more reticence to jump in on this at this moment because they're actually being faced with the real facts of what the House laid out yesterday, and those facts were very troubling. So the fact that the governor is not necessarily jumping to the defense of the Attorney General, a position he held himself for many years, at this moment, just from a political standpoint, let alone any sort of ethical or requirement standpoint, is really not surprising, because I think for the most part, most people, most Republicans in the state do not want to touch this with a 10-foot pole at the moment.
Well, Senator Cruz came out in support of Paxton.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Cornyn told me the other day he found the testimony very troubling.
Yeah, but again, these are two political actors in Texas who are not actually attached to the fundamental process that is taking place right here that is required of these members. And that makes a big difference. Ultimately, Senator Cruz, Senator Cornyn are not really constrained by any sort of need to remain impartial in this, as maybe a state senator might. And also, ultimately, at the end of the day, they're not going to partake in this process.